I am delighted to introduce our next panel on civic culture and civic education. Colleen Sheehan, our colleague, a professor of politics in SCETL, is panel chair, and she will introduce the panelists. She has not only been a distinguished professor at both Villanova University and a visiting distinguished professor at the University of Colorado at Boulder, but she has also served in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives and on the Pennsylvania State Board of Education. She's a recipient of numerous fellowships from the Earhart and Bradley Foundations and the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the author of a range of books, including most recently, or an editor, the Cambridge Companion to the Federalist. So I welcome Colleen Sheehan to introduce our panel.
Yes, indeed. I served on the Pennsylvania School Board, the very thing that Catherine Zuckert said, if you want to be bored about politics, go to a school board meeting. So it's a pleasure to be here, and it's especially a pleasure to have Harvey Mansfield here, and Anna. Thank you so much for making the trip. This panel, believe it or not, is on civic education. This one on civic culture and civic education, and we have three wonderful panelists. First of all, Elizabeth Corey. Elizabeth is an associate professor of political science and director of the honors program at Baylor University. She writes in various venues, including First Things, National Affairs, the Wall Street Journal, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. She received her bachelor's in classics from Oberlin College and her master's and PhD in art history and political science from LSU. Elizabeth serves on the board of directors of the Institute of Religion and Public Life and is publisher of First Things. Tunku Varadarajan is a fellow at AEI. He focuses on American politics, political economy, political ideologies, society and culture, immigration and integration, and also the Constitution. He is also a fellow at the Classical Liberal Institute at NYU, NYU School of Law, and writes for the editorial page and book section, and a contributing writer at the Wall Street Journal. He is also a fellow at the Center of Capitalism and Society at Columbia University and a contributing editor for Politico Europe. Before joining AEI, he was the executive editor at the Hoover Institute and editor of Defining Ideas, Hoover's in-house publication. He's taught at various places, including Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism, NYU's School of Journalism, and Stern School of Business, and the University of Oxford. Renn is a consultant and writer in Indianapolis. His work focuses on culture and public policy. He's a columnist for Governing Magazine, and his work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, a theme I'm hearing here today, also the New York Times and the Atlantic. He was formerly a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and managing director at Accenture. Please join me in welcoming all three panelists. We'll start with Elizabeth Corey.
Thank you, Colleen, and thanks to Will Hay and Paul Cariz. I wanted to restate the question or the prompt that was put before us for this panel, just so we have it in mind. It goes as follows. While civic education often takes a top-down approach to teaching patriotism, other formative influences operate in local communities from the bottom up and reflect their strengths or weaknesses. So our question is, how do communities foster the habits of heart and mind behind reflective patriotism, and where does civic education fit in the project of revitalizing towns and regions facing other problems? I don't know that I answer this, but I want to make 3 points in getting at some of the things that I think might begin to answer that question. Nothing I'm going to say today is original or new. I'm drawing on the thought of Robert Nisbet, Michael Oakeshott, Tocqueville, and many others, and I'm going to restate things that I think we all know to be true, but which are often not stated explicitly enough. So point 1, I'll just tell you the points, then I'll talk about the points, and then I'll tell you I've done it. Point 1, I think the realm of the political has been overemphasized in our age. I think we all probably know this very well. We think about this often, but it's true and worth stating. Point 2, a fuller political realm, that is, of politics as a certain kind of communal action, has at the same time been devalued and is also often considered unimportant. Far more of our lives than the so-called merely political might be rightly understood as contributing to our communal and political good. And point 3, we are fundamentally social beings, and we must recognize and cultivate that sociality, as I'll call it, if we want to find long-lasting happiness and fulfillment. And although we don't engage in our local social projects and organizations, associations, for the purpose of fostering a healthy polity, that's not why we do them. We do them for a variety of other intermediate ends. All these things do have the effect of promoting what I think is a healthy civic culture, where people are invested and feel that their activity actually has consequences. This was raised at the end of the last panel, so I think it follows well here. So to point 1, politics has been overemphasized in our age. What do I mean? When I say politics is overemphasized, I mean that all of us are now prone to think in political terms, in the ordinary sense of Democrat, Republican, conservative, progressive. We love the battle of politics, and we even tend to love politics as entertainment. We also increasingly judge others, even our family and friends, by their stances on contentious issues and on the virtue signaling they do or don't do about particular issues. I also think we unreflectively tend to think of politics as only the kind of activity that consists in electoral jockeying, the things that go on in legislatures and in Washington, D.C., and on TV news channels, blogs, and websites. Political activity here is understood as something that has to do with big issues and with power, with friends and enemies, in groups and out groups. And certainly that's true, but I would say that engaging in this kind of politics is really not where most of us ought to be spending our time. So to point 2, I think there's another way of thinking about politics that can include and encompass a very different kind of activity. Many people might call this, or be inclined to call this, the private realm, but I want to say that our activities that we typically think of as private are far more connected to our communal life than we often think. I am not saying, of course, that all of life is political in the sense that we must begin to indoctrinate our children into ideologies when they're toddlers, or that we must put into practice some kind of egalitarian utopia in our marriage and family lives. What I am saying in a weird sort of way is that the personal is political, and it is more than that, social. And I mean that in a way directly opposed to the normal meaning of the personal is political. We all know that phrase from second-wave feminism, where it conveys the idea that women are oppressed all the way down, and even the family ought to be reconfigured to promote some progressive notion of gender equality. But I mean, by contrast, that the personal is political because nothing we do is unconnected with the communal life of a society. I think our lives are potentially constructive all the way up, from the smallest and most private actions to those that are public and visible. The things that are dearest to me personally, raising children, relationships with neighbors and family, cooking for other people, teaching students, writing, cultivating family relationships, and being married, all these things preserve and recreate culture. And I would say these humble activities are no less important because they're unseen by other people. They're often more important than what we do in public because they have concrete impacts on particular persons. And they're also political in the broadest sense because we are forming the characters of those who live around us and who will go on to form others in turn. And we do this by engaging in various human practices of friendship, of neighborliness, study, worship, commerce, and work, and of course, also politics as we normally think of it. But all these activities, I would say, are essentially recreative in that they create and recreate the values and goods and institutions of our society. Sometimes, of course, we find ourselves needing to protect and defend these goods, and of course, there are times we need to fight for them, but the fighting part is not the essence of the activity. More important is the building up, as Yuval has so eloquently said in his, not his current book, but his last book. I think we are building when we address ourselves toward good things, and especially toward the goods that foster sociality, socialness. When we act in our roles as parents, teachers, vestry members, churchgoers, even school board members, colleagues to those we work with, children of our parents, sisters and brothers, friends. In all these relationships, we are essentially acting socially and politically to promote a common good that actually touches the lives of people far more directly and deeply than the politics of Washington, D.C. ever does. Oakeshott puts it this way: on occasion, a society may be preserved and may survive by means of political action, but to make it live requires a social activity of a different sort, of a different and more radical character. And its life is as often threatened by political success as it is by political failure. And this requires all the activities I've been describing, even the philosopher, the artist, the musician. And again, to quote Oakeshott, the genius of the poet, the artist, and to a lesser extent the philosopher, is to create and recreate the values of their society. In them, a society becomes conscious and critical of itself, of its whole self. Point 3, which is really to emphasize something I've already been saying. And this is something we all know. We are fundamentally social beings, and we must consciously cultivate that sociality if we want to find long-lasting happiness and fulfillment. As I've already said, although we don't engage in these kinds of associations and friendships and relationships for the purpose of a healthy polity, we do them for the other immediate ends, they do have the effect of promoting a healthy civic culture, where people are invested and feel their activity actually has real consequences. If COVID taught us nothing else, it certainly showed us how absolutely vital contact with other people is in the pursuit of human happiness. This is something we all knew, but we didn't seem to know it quite so well as we do now. The British philosopher F.H. Bradley describes the human condition like this. I think it's interesting. Man is a social being. He is real only because he is social. And he can realize himself only because it is as social that he realizes himself. The mere individual is a delusion of theory, and the attempt to realize it in practice is the starvation and mutilation of human nature with total sterility or the production of monstrosities. It's the old argument that there is something in civic associations that makes us happy. I'm restating arguments of Robert Nisbet, as I said before, and of Tocqueville before him. Here's Nisbet: the quest for community will not be denied, for it springs from some of the most powerful needs of human nature. Needs for a clear sense of cultural purpose, membership, status, and continuity. Without these goods, Nisbet continues, no amount of mere material welfare will serve to arrest the developing sense of alienation in our society. So to build meaningful institutions from the ground up, as this panel description phrases it, asks us to cultivate personal qualities that are less critical and adversarial, more admiring and attention-paying. To do this would be a truly countercultural stance. And a comment about liberal learning, too. As Jen Frey said this morning, we might cultivate also habits of submitting to refutation, humility, etc. This would probably positively impact our friendships as well. It is all part of pursuing common goods together, as is liberal education as well. It is all to cultivate the gratitude that also was talked about this morning by Dan Mahoney, the availability or disposability that Gabrielle Marcel talks about, the affirmation of human life that conservatives tend to be so good at. And I think this is precisely the kind of work we should be doing. I'm sure we'll talk more about this in the questions. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tunku Varadarajan. I was born in India, moved to Britain as a teenager, and came to live in the United States in my 30s. So as such, my life has been a case of constant civic upgrades. I'm foremost a journalist, and so my paper is really going to partake more of the flavor of an op-ed than of a scholarly paper, so I hope you'll forgive me that lapse into demotic banality. So I was on a panel at a literary festival early last year in Dhaka, Bangladesh. I can't remember the precise title of the panel, but it was about America's role in the world. Malign, of course. And it quickly devolved into a bout of America bashing on the part of my fellow panelists. These were a leftist American historian, a local leftist intellectual, Bengali, and a leftist British documentary maker. So what in blazes was I doing there? Perhaps it was a case of mistaken identity. I have a brother who edits a progressive website in India, and they thought perhaps that they were getting one Varadarajan and instead got the other. They got the one from the American Enterprise Institute. So everything the panelists said that morning that dissed America was greeted with applause from the audience. The audience was elite by local standards in that they all understood English and had the leisure time to spend a weekday afternoon at a literary festival. Everything I said was met with an almost ghostly silence. Until I said the following. I said, if I stand with a big sign in the middle of any city in Bangladesh, a sign that says, the first 20 people to shake my hand get to live in the United States, I'd be trampled to death in under a minute by people who want to live in the United States rushing to shake my hand. Now, this observation of mine was greeted with hissing, booing, derision. People felt insulted, indignant. One young lady in a front row seat shouted out, "How can you say such a thing? What proof do you have?" To which I asked for a show of hands. How many of you, I asked the audience, have relatives who live in the United States? 3/4 of my audience raised their hands. QED, I said. There's my proof. Adding that these people, these Bangladeshis who live in the United States, remitted $975 million from the US to their native land in 2022 alone. Now, what has all of this got to do with civic culture and civic education in the United States? Rather a lot, in truth, and perhaps more so about civic culture than about civic education. Now, why would Bangladeshis trample me to death to get to live in the United States? Not just Bangladeshis, I wager. If I stood with my Come to America sign in any city of the third world, I think we're still allowed to say that, and even many European cities outside Northern Europe, I'd be besieged by people who want to live here. Why do they want to come? It's not just the money. And it's not, thank you, Tucker Carlson, for our subway systems, which are sadly bereft of Muscovite chandeliers. And it's not for the Chick-fil-A Super Deluxe combo with large fries and honey sriracha sauce, although I'd gladly pay a coyote to take me to a place that sells one of those, as I had the other night. Why do they come? It's for America's civic culture, for the opportunity to live and thrive and flourish and raise a family in the greatest civitas in human history. Civitas, that's a word we don't use often enough. The body of citizens who are bound together by rights and responsibilities. The immigrant sees our civitas most obviously because he comes from a land where such a civic corpus is absent or fractured or undeveloped or has imploded. I'm reading a book right now called The Great Wave, a reference to the woodcut by the Japanese artist Hokusai. It's a book by Michiko Kakutani, the erstwhile chief book reviewer of the New York Times. Now, I'm not reading it out of choice. it's been assigned to me for review, so there's an element of compulsion. So if you see me with gritted teeth, it's because I'm reacting to her particularly hysterical blue-stocking brand of progressivism. Now she says, and she is in many ways the polar opposite of Yuval Levin, who spoke this morning and whose book I think is, I haven't read it yet, but from the message of his talk, is likely also to be the polar opposite of Ms. Kakutani's The Great Wave. Now, she says, American democracy is having a, quote, near-death experience right now, with MAGA Republicans, quotes, trying to roll back the progress made in civil rights, end quotes, and the Supreme Court resurrecting Jim Crow by ruling against racial preferences, which we've all been taught to call affirmative action, and subjugating women by, quotes, eliminating the constitutional right to abortion, end quotes. But the immigrants who throng to America, whether lawfully or unlawfully, don't see America the way Michiko Kakutani does, or perhaps the way many of us do. We're not Michiko Kakutani-esque in our disenchantment with many aspects of American life, but we're all here because we believe that something in America has gone wrong that needs fixing. We're right about that, but let's not forget, or ignore, or overlook, or glide past the great deal that is good and strong and resilient and cohesive and coherent and enviable about this country. Let's not look past the qualities that this country has that drew my Peruvian cleaning lady to come here unlawfully 15 years ago while her daughter in Lima was still a child, and to work here without seeing her daughter for 15 years, so the daughter could finish high school, then go to college, and then go to law school. My cleaning lady has now gone back to Lima to take care of her elderly parents. But guess what her daughter has done? The one who went to law school, the one who didn't see her mother for 15 years. She's come to America. So let us celebrate America for what it is, even as we hold America to the very highest standards, which we believe it isn't yet meeting or has ceased to meet. And even as we strive here collectively to find ways to repair our fraying civitas. Do we need civic education? Of course we do. But who among us needs it? It's easy to say that the young do. And just because that sounds trite doesn't mean that it isn't right. My son went to a fancy and vaunted private school in Brooklyn for 12 years. He had more exposure in his time there to, quotes, storytelling by drag queens than he did to civics. Everything he knows about the American Constitution, about America's civic architecture, about the way America conducts itself as a democracy bound by law and laws, he learned from his parents, from me and from my wife, in lessons embedded in conversation at the dinner table, on trips to Washington and Boston and Philadelphia, father and son trips to teach him about our civitas. Now, one of the prompts that was given to this panel was the following: how do communities foster the habits of heart and mind behind reflective patriotism? Well, one answer is good parenting. We were able to do it because we were taught these things in school. Good civic parenting cannot be done by parents who were not themselves taught about the rules and values and procedures of our civic intercourse. So American schools must do what younger American parents cannot do. Now, one important caveat here. All of us gathered here agree, I think, that with civic illiteracy all around us, a revival of civics education would be welcome. But we need to be careful to distinguish which kind. One current movement wants to drill students in social justice activism in the name of civics. Equity is a part of their civics. White privilege is a civic evil. Black Lives Matter is a civic shibboleth. All lives matter is a racist verbal assault. The core American values of free speech and a government that respects it no longer enjoys near unanimous support from Americans. Instead, we have much of the American elite convinced that unless online misinformation, defined as nearly anything the elites disagree with, is squashed and speech suppressed, democracy is in peril. Now, a better, older ideal of civics education emphasizes neutral training in skills and understandings of how voting, elections, and lawmaking work, how to speak effectively at or help run a public meeting, how responsibilities differ between different levels of government, and so forth. Information that's useful, no, essential to students, whatever the content of their convictions. But it isn't only the young who need lessons in civics. Those who shape the young need lessons too. Why stop at those who shape the young? What about those who shape America and shape America's place in the world? It pains me to say this, but the erosion of civic values can be seen most starkly in the United States Congress. What else is the failure to support Ukraine but a failure of civic duty? Our nation's sense of community, our lawmakers' sense of community, has shrunk. Honey, who shrunk the congressman? As the world's leading nation, as the world's guiding light, our civic responsibilities extend beyond our borders, beyond picayune calculations of what is American and what is not, to the protection of embattled democracies around the world, to the protection of Ukraine's democracy, Israel's democracy, Taiwan's democracy. In strengthening them, we strengthen ourselves. In leaving Ukraine to Putin's mercy, we diminish ourselves and we devalue our own civitas. Now, in any discussion of civics education, mention must be made of a great American who's also one of this country's most squandered assets. I refer to Douglas H. Ginsburg, senior judge on the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. He would have made an all-time great justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, but it was not to be, as he withdrew himself from consideration in November 1987, after the media started to hound him for a picayune infraction when he'd been in college. Now, Judge Ginsburg has made it his life's mission to spread civic education in the United States. As he noted in a letter to the Wall Street Journal in May 2023, some months after I had interviewed him for that newspaper, in response to the National Assessment for Educational Progress, which is sometimes referred to as the nation's report card, he said, only 22% of 8th grade students scored at or above the proficient level in civics, continuing a downward trend for civics knowledge among students since 2014. When nearly 8 in 10 students lack a fundamental understanding of why our government was designed as it is, no one should be surprised with the lack of civil discourse today. Voters are unaware of their rights, or even how to define rights, and high school graduates can't even name the 2 branches of the Congress, much less explain why there are 2. We can't sustain a constitutional republic, he continued, with a citizenry that is estranged from our Constitution and our institutions. And we don't have to. Nearly everything a student or teacher would need to know about the basic setup and functions of our government is available at no cost. The National Constitution Center's Interactive Constitution, the National Archives website, civicfundamentals.org, and many others offer excellent nonpartisan online tools to learn about our government, history, and rights. With all the free resources available, there is no excuse for America's low civic scores. I emailed him yesterday to tell him I'd be at ASU and at SCETL, and to ask him if he had any thoughts that would help me raise my talk above the banal and the humdrum. And he had this to say. I'm going to quote him again. Civics education in the United States is at an abysmal level. The great majority of our fellow citizens could not pass the test that aliens must pass to become citizens. Millions of recent high school graduates cannot name the 2 houses of Congress. That's a particular bugbear with him. Nearly half the public think even lawful alien residents have no constitutional rights. Their ignorance is a danger to the future of our country. They are easily led astray by candidates promising to do blatantly unconstitutional things. I hope this helps, he says. Feel free to name me. Now, his email got me thinking. Why not offer incentives for native-born Americans to take the test that aliens must pass to become citizens? Applicants for citizenship must answer 6 of 10 questions correctly. It's a pretty low bar. Can some civic-minded philanthropist, not offer $500 to every American adult who volunteers to take the test? A husband and wife can make $1,000 if they take the test together. Make it a little harder than 6 out of 10 so that we encourage people to learn civics to a fuller extent than the bare minimum. Let people take the test as often as they like until they score 8 or 9 out of 10. $500 a head. Are you listening, Peter Thiel? Are you listening, Elon Musk? I'll conclude by stressing that civics education is only a part of what would help repair America. There are other components to a well-ordered, well-functioning civitas. A culture of reasoned debate is important. Understanding the basics of Western civilization and why it works is important. Property rights and rule of law are not happenstances to be rethought every generation. They embody long experience. The spectacular success of our economic system over the last few centuries is something few appreciate and matters greatly for how we run the country. We're not wealthier than our ancestors because the government forced transfers from robber barons to workers or stopped the introduction of tractors and machines for equity. Just as important as the teaching of civics in schools is the teaching of economics. Good economics, one might say, makes for good civics. But even here we must be careful. What is good economics? Who will decide what we teach? The economics that everyone here might regard as the blessed gospel is derided by the left, in fact by Michiko Kakutani in her book, as, quotes, free market fundamentalism. To quote Yuval from his paper today, how can we act together when we don't think alike? Now I'll end with a little metaphor which I used on my son when he was a teenager to explain civics to him. And pardon me if it is a tiny bit hokey, but it was serviceable for a 15-year-old. If you imagine America as a car, the car being the nation on its journey, you have the US Constitution as the GPS or the roadmap. You have the economy as the fuel. You have education as the accelerator. And you have our history as the brakes. And what is civics and civics education in this national car of ours? It is the steering wheel, of course, but it's also the seat belts and the airbags, the things that prevent us from getting injured or even dying in the event of a collision. So let the ride begin. Thank you.
We're here at an academic institution, and the majority of our speakers here today are academics, but I am not. I come from a management consulting background, so that's the professional lens I'm going to bring to my talk today. And I want to say thank you for inviting me to this wonderful event. And I want to talk about one specific type of civics education, which is civic leadership development programs in urban areas. Because I noticed a curious thing. We have seen incredible growth in the amount of civic leadership development programs in our cities over the last 30 years, and yet it seems like the actual amount of leadership that we get in our communities have declined. There has never been more leadership development programs, yet there still seems to be a leadership gap. And since my understanding and my sense of the market here is that most people in America seem to sense that we do have a leadership gap in many of our cities, I'm not going to spend any time, in the interest of time, trying to defend that proposition. But if you'd like to talk about it more, I'd be delighted to do that. So these civic development programs have been around a while. They might go back as far as the 1950s even, but it's really been since the 1990s that they've taken off. The National Leadership Network, which is an association of these groups, has over 800 member organizations, but I'm guessing that's just a fraction of what's out there. I live in Indianapolis, so in Indianapolis we have an organization called Leadership Indianapolis, and it is the organization that runs our flagship program, the Stanley K. Lacey Executive Leadership Series. But a few years ago, some friends of Mitch Daniels created the Mitch Daniels Leadership Foundation that also does something there. Both the Republican and the Democratic parties run different leadership programs. The Republican Women's Leadership Program in Indiana is called the Lugar Series, named after our former Senator Richard Lugar. It's been around about 30 years, so right in line with the growth of these things. The Indiana Family Institute, which is our social conservative family policy council, has a leadership program. The International Center of Indianapolis runs a global leadership series. The Indiana University Kelley School of Business has a leadership development program, not one for students, but for community members. Many of our suburban counties run their own programs, and I keep finding more of these things every time I turn around that I'd never heard of before. And so here's how these programs work. Typically, you have to apply to be accepted, and being accepted into one of these programs is typically prestigious or an honor, something that marks you out as a rising up-and-coming leader in the community. A lot of them are targeted at people in their 30s. So these are people who've had time to start demonstrating that they're performing above and beyond, and might be the next generation of leaders. And then the people they admit they bring together in a cohort that's led by a chairman or a moderator, they're called different things, which is a more senior civic leader, maybe the head of one of the local civic organizations, a CEO, a retired politician or judge, someone of that type. And then for over the course of generally a year, they spend a day per month getting together and hearing a bunch of presentations. When you'll hear about leadership, how to be a leader, the importance of leadership in cities. You will hear about the different entities and organizations in town and what they do. Maybe you'll hear about some of the history of various civic developments. Maybe someone would talk about what ASU has been doing, for example, here in Arizona. You might get a presentation on data about your community and its challenges and opportunities. Maybe you'll take a field trip and you'll go visit a big project that someone did. And so the idea is you're learning about the community and how it functions to equip you to be a leader in that community. And then often at the end, sometimes as a year or two even, you have to put what you've learned to work by performing some capstone project. So you're going to actually do something in the community. You can think of it as like the equivalent of an Eagle Scout project or something of that nature. And I think these are good programs. I haven't attended one, but I have spoken at them and I've sat in on them, and there's a lot of great stuff in there. But it doesn't seem that they're actually producing a lot of new high-performance leaders. And when I look around my community, I say, who are the highest wattage, highest performing, high impact leaders who are doing big, difficult, transformational things? All of them are essentially post-retirement age boomers who came of age really before these programs took off and didn't really go through them. Mitch Daniels himself, our former governor, is a great example of this. So, after he was governor, he became president of Purdue University and got a lot of press for a lot of the changes he did there. For example, freezing tuition for a decade. So Purdue has not raised tuition since 2013 when he became president, which is pretty remarkable, but I don't think that he learned what he was doing in one of these programs. And I think this shows, to me, these programs seem to be an attempt to respond to the perceived decline in civic leadership. We see that we're not producing the leaders that we see that we're not getting the leadership, so why don't we create programs to try to do that? And I think this shows a little bit the limits of civics education to address problems in the community. Because when you have sort of structural changes that are generating sort of negative outcomes, you could think of the proverbial decline of our intermediate institutions. I don't think that it's possible to simply make up for that through additional education. So for example, I don't believe that we're going to raise our voter participation rate by educating people about why it's important in a democracy that people vote, although that might be part of the solution. I think the fact that these voter participation is down is telling us something profound about what's going on in our society. And we need to look at some of the underlying structural changes that have driven some of these things. So I asked, what are some of the structural changes that may have undermined leadership in our cities? And I'll just list a few off. One is corporate consolidation, particularly of banks. If you go back to the 1980s, most cities had basically locally owned banks, locally owned utilities, locally owned department stores, drugstore chains. And the CEO of the biggest bank in town was probably the biggest power player. Well, now most of those have been consolidated into large national and global concerns. And so the local head of the largest bank in town is now probably a regional manager for a global banking corporation headquartered in New York or San Francisco. A second one would be the loss of blue bloods and sort of old money families. So there's been essentially a decline in the old society, if you will. But many of these communities had essentially old money families with dynastic wealth that was very rooted in and committed to those cities intergenerationally. And what you often see now is the new generations that are coming of age, they go off to Ivy League schools, and then they take their trust fund to New York or San Francisco. They don't want to come back and live in flyover country. A good friend of mine is the urbanist Joel Kotkin. Some of you may know him. He speaks at events all over the country, and he says invariably when he speaks at an event in a city, the richest guy in the room has a kid and lives in either New York or San Francisco. So the next generations are basically gone in a lot of these cases. A third is that we've had a sort of politicization of the business world. And not, in this case, politicization doesn't mean party politics, but it means that things that were traditionally considered maybe outside the scope of business are now ideological imperatives inside the business. So the economic, social, and governance goals, the ESG movement, is an example of that. So the people who are those regional managers now have to be very aware of all these landmines that they can't step on, and it very much constrains what they can do. They don't have as much power as the old CEOs to begin with. Now they have all these other considerations hemming them in. And then the fourth one is the kind of democratization and bureaucratization of civic leadership. So if you go back to the 80s, who were those bank presidents and other leaders? Well, it really was a relatively small group of old white men. And that's not the case anymore. We have more diverse and inclusive leadership in our cities. That's a good thing. It's also challenging, more challenging, to get more input from more people and corral them all into supporting a program. So when you're trying to get 100 to 150 people aligned on something more, rather than 10 or 15, it's obviously more difficult, and you tends to be very process-oriented, becomes very bureaucratic, et cetera. And so what you see is, I think as a result of these and potentially other things, if we now in many of our cities have a sort of timid, very conformist, essentially very risk-averse leadership groups. Again, a lot of these people are now essentially regional managers of global corporations, and they're understandably worried about how what they do is going to affect their career, and they don't want to take on a lot of risk in the civic sector that might blow up in their face. And I think we read a lot of press from kind of the coastal cities where there actually is a very lively debate, I think, in sort of local issues, if you will. And I think that can cause us to not see that in most of America, there's actually very little disagreement in local areas. We talked a lot about polarization today. Well, if you go to the average Chamber of Commerce luncheon in a major American city, every single person is going to be singing from the same hymnal. Tremendous conformity and unanimity of thought. I've been to a ton of conferences about urban policy, and I'm always amazed that everybody who speaks there is in agreement, basically, on all the big issues and what needs to be done. From anything from climate change to inclusive zoning, you name it. Most of it is disagreements around the margins. And so I think if we're going to look at something like civic education as addressing this leadership deficit in cities, then it needs to be targeted at the conditions some of these structural changes have produced. And I think, perversely, and I think clearly unintentionally, many of these programs might actually be making things worse by the way that they operate. because what do a lot of them do? They tell you how things work in the town, and that's exactly what you would think of civics education, like, educating in our school children, how does the federal government work? This is educating rising leaders about how the community works, and yet it can very easily turn into a sort of indoctrination into how to go along to get along within the existing system. And it really doesn't encourage people to rock the boat or anything of that nature. Quite the opposite, in fact. Although I think there are, I know of a couple of exceptions there. And so what I would suggest is if we wanted to make these programs more effective, they should be targeted at this risk-averse, conformist leadership environment that has been created. So we should stress in the education process the importance of taking public risk as one of the things that is a core part of what it means to be, a civic leader. We should talk about things like productive courage, courage in being willing to take stands that might be controversial or unpopular, but productive in the sense that it is targeted towards tangible positive outcomes for the community. It's not just rhetorical bomb throwing or being a provocateur to get social media clips. And then my other idea is we should have a requirement going in that if you want to be in this program, your capstone project is going to have to involve something that is at least somewhat controversial or makes at least some people other than, say, Trump voters unhappy. So force people to have skin in the game, and then have this chairman and of course the board as the organization be ready to promote and reward people and back them for doing that. And of course it would be appropriate for them to also exercise some oversight and encourage people to do things that are going to be actually appropriate risks to take on. But I think in that way we start building our muscle of people doing things like that. And so I think in general what I would say is, based on what I've seen in this leadership education movement in cities, civics education can be, it is not going to fully make up for negative structural changes that have undermined certain aspects of our society, but it can be part of the solution, but it has to be targeted, if you will, at the very specific things that we're trying to overcome. So thank you very much.
Thank you all very much. We have quite an array of ideas and solutions on the table. I don't know quite how they all fit together. So let me see if I actually have some questions that might at least attempt to bring them together in some way or fashion. I think what I heard was the following overall question: how do we create a healthy civic culture? And I heard that summarized as, how do we create a healthy civic culture, particularly on the ground, in our cities, in our towns, and perhaps even more specifically in the hearts and minds of our citizens. That this has to do with civitas, with citizenship, ultimately, that this is not an abstraction, that this has to do with the, well, as we learned from Tocqueville, that this has to do with habits of the heart. But remember, Tocqueville not only talked about habits of the heart, he also talked about patterns of the mind, or what I think might be called public opinion. Public opinion in that sense, not of popular opinion, fleeting opinion, but that more settled way of how a people thinks about something in a more fixed way. So I'm reminded of, I couldn't help but thinking all along as I was listening of the 8th book of Aristotle's Politics, that if you want a regime to last, you have to think about the importance of educating the citizens in the spirit of the regime. In a monarchy, you have to educate the citizens in the spirit of the monarchy. In a democracy, in the spirit of the democracy. Or in America, if we're a republic in the spirit of republicanism. What does that mean if we're not going to talk about just from the top down? If somehow this has to do with from the bottom up, if it's not just looking at education from our masters or from statesmen, then how do the people teach each other the tools of Republican government, the tools of self-government? I think this is why Tocqueville emphasized New England town hall meetings and voluntary associations. You know, you just think of Ben Franklin when he talks about Philadelphia, and he's talking about the volunteer fire departments and all of those kinds of things. I always think of baseball, and then I think I think of what a friend once said. We were co-teaching a class on Jefferson, and he was trying to get people to understand what Jefferson was talking about democracy, and he said, well, you know, it's like baseball. It's the only game where those who don't have the ball score all the points. And I think there's something to that. What does that mean in terms of, how does that work? How do you make something like that happen in a democratic republic? If civic culture is essentially habits of heart and habits of mind, if it has something to do with public sentiment and public opinion, Elizabeth looked at, she said we have to look away from DC to something more real in a kind of Oakshottian way. Tunku talked about different kinds of civitas, different kinds of civic education, and said some kinds are not genuine, and we better be careful about that. And then Aaron warned us that we had better get moving and be more practical and employ some productive courage. I wonder if that means then that pluralism is simply not enough, and that that even if I wish Danielle were here, but we can bring her into the conversation later, if we're going to talk about civic education and how it relates to civic culture, that we're going to have to be more robust about that. I mean, I want to ask the panelists, do we have to go beyond pluralism as we talk about this, even if it might step on some others? I mean, maybe it's going to create some problems along the way, but is pluralism not enough? Do we have to, are we at that kind of crossroads in the country where if we try to please everyone, we'll end up getting nowhere? Or is it possible to move forward in this fractured situation, in this culture that we're trying to create these programs today to bind the country in some way, partly through our educational system, to keep us glued together, and that it is pluralism that will move us forward? What do you think?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure how to answer the question, do we need to go beyond pluralism? But I think one of the things I was trying to say in thinking about this question, I'm not necessarily sure that the answer is, as Aaron is talking about, leadership development programs. I feel like those, I haven't been involved in them in the way you have, so I don't know from firsthand, but it seems to me that's kind of putting a structure on something that's not existing already, but the better way is to go and to try to build up from the smaller things that are existing already. Now, school boards, everybody's, criticized school boards this morning, and I agree the meetings are very boring, but there are lots of other things you can do in a smaller community that are not very boring and that are sort of co-labors. I mean, think about you talk about pluralism. when you're in a co-labor with a group of people who you may not agree with, the very fact of co-laboring with them gives you a kind of bond that you didn't have otherwise. And it seems to me those are where the more organic and more healthy civic culture is cultivated, because you simply have to work together to do something. It's like in any situation where you go through something hard together, suddenly there's a bond there that wasn't there before. And to the extent we can, not worry about the political views of our neighbors, but engage in something with our neighbors, then we have some hope, I think, of getting maybe past the pluralist problem.
So process in and of itself.
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say, I think we have to get beyond like the theories of some of these things, because it really is like how it works out in the practice of our daily lives. I've got this friend who talks about the Constitution, and that he loves the Constitution. But he's like, there's the sense in which the Constitution is the document in our systems of government, but there's the sense in which the Constitution is us, and the way that we live, and the way that we act, the way that we do. And if it doesn't matter how good the actual document is, if we're not living out that way of life, just like we couldn't just hand our documents and our laws to other countries and expect it to happen. I think there's a lot of that still in many communities, but it tends to be wealthier, more monolithically higher educated communities where all the stuff that we say we want to see still goes on. I grew up in a very rural area, and I lived in big cities most of my life. And then the last year, I've lived in a suburb of Indianapolis called Carmel, and I'm like, wow, I can't believe this place. Like, it's almost like, there's like people who volunteer here, and there's like a civic life and a government that's responsive and trust, and like, how did this happen? And, I think part of it is, in like the town where I grew up in, there's so much social dysfunction now that the civic life has kind of fallen apart there. And so I don't know the answer to that, but I do think being able to find a community where you can model certain practices that then spread. So there's a guy, I'll just give one example. There's a guy who's the president of the city council in my town. His name was Jeff Worrell, and he was the former head of the chamber, a long-term resident and businessman. And he said, I ran for city council because I saw that our community was very divisive, a lot of political disputes and a lot of dirty laundry being aired in the media. And he said, I'm running, and I'm going to pledge to never publicly disparage our community. I'm pledging that I will never publicly disparage anyone else. I'm going to be positive about our community. And I don't know if it was just him, but, really, we don't have what we had before. And I love his re-election, his little yard signs for re-election: positive, personable, proven. And the idea that I'm going to be positive, I'm going to model out what it means to be positive, in a community that's small enough and high functioning enough, I think can change the culture in positive ways. But it's the way that we ourselves live, I think, more than any of the theories to some extent.
I'll be brief. I think we're dangerously close to no longer being a plural society, but being instead a society that's comprised of multiple warring tribes, and really the need of the hour, the need of the moment, the civic need of the hour is really to find ways to get people to. The word compromise was used earlier in many of the conversations. Not just compromise, but to resolve disputes and disagreements and conflicts between themselves, and not for the conflict to be the terminus, and the acceptance that there is conflict between my tribe and yours, and there's nothing we can do about it, but instead to understand that there is disagreement, and that the disagreement is simply one step on the way to a kind of mutual shaking of hands, agreeing to disagree, toleration. So I think Americans need, quote unquote, lessons in conflict resolution. A simple example, it touched home to me in a very personal way. As part of my job at the Wall Street Journal, I was sent on assignment to interview the two ladies who run Moms for Liberty. down in Florida. And the piece was published a couple of days later, and then I get a message in my inbox from a friend of many years with whom I was supposed to have dinner, saying that she was cancelling dinner because I had hung out and had said nice things about Moms for Liberty. So this is somebody I'd known for 20 years, and she was incapable of simply accepting the fact that I had pursued an assignment. So we patched up later, but I'm giving you an example. Her first instinct was to cancel the dinner.
We have a few more minutes before we open this up to questions from the audience. I want to just push this a little bit further, and if you don't want to push it further, that's fine. But let me try this. So on the 4th of July, we all watch the fireworks together. Do the parade, watch the fireworks. The kids all play together. People participate together. They're neighbors together. They have a picnic together. It's wonderful when small towns come together and participate that way, and they act like neighbors together. Let's say they have a potluck even. They take a meal together. And so they're not just all on their cell phones looking down. They're sharing in each other's lives. I totally agree that you can't have communities without people coming to know each other and sharing in some way. That process, that living together is absolutely critical. My question is what about the creed? Can we dispense with a common creed? So it's the 4th of July. They don't share a common creed. They share the fireworks together, but they don't share a common creed. Will that work? Moving on.
I think that's a great question, to be quite honest, is, we can all come together on certain points, but as long as it remains at that level of enjoying the fireworks together and the parade. But once it gets into deeper substance, then how do we do that? Can that translate into some sustainable relationship or life together, even in the presence of these disagreements? Because we share this certain creed or this commitment to a set of institutions or principles. That's a great question, and obviously we're trending in the wrong direction on that point.
I mean, it's harder and hard. It's getting harder and harder to have what you call a common creed, given the relentless emphasis in school, sometimes from the very earliest stages, like kindergarten, on the differences between us, the differences between children, the differences between races, the differences between religions, the differences between languages, food, and even attempts to bridge these differences. If I wanted to celebrate Cinco de Mayo, I'm culturally appropriating something that isn't mine. And so, yes, I love the idea of a common creed, and there is, and we do come together on occasions. It's the 4th of July. I shudder to say this, but it's true. Also Halloween, things like that. My street in Brooklyn has never been more communitarian, loving, brotherly, fraternal than it has been on Halloween, when we all sit on our stoops and hand out candy to all comers together and greet and say good evening and thank you and trick or treat. But
it's civic creed.
Yeah. No, but I mean, I think there's creeds. I mean, the ultimate civic creed is that we're all American. But it's harder to maintain because we're encouraged to believe that we're different, and that the differences matter, and that the differences are defining, definitive, game-changing.
Yeah, I don't know that I have anything to add.
Okay. And so, questions from the audience? And I'll just end that question with another question in case anybody from the audience wants to pick it up. And if there isn't a common civic creed, what is the purpose of civic education?
I mean, there is a common civic creed. And the purpose of civic education is to emphasize it, to underscore it, to strengthen it, to give it scaffolding, to repair it from its present damaged state. And so, but the commonality of the civic creed has been allowed to wither away, and that's our problem.
I can't help but hear this question being phrased as a false dichotomy. Can't we both be different and be American? Can't we have some differences and have one common, and have some commonalities?
Absolutely. It's just that the differences have tended now to drown out or overshadow the commonalities. In an ideal world, yes, we would be both American and whatever else we want to be, as long as that other thing doesn't diminish or erode or subtract from our Americanness. But yes, I mean, we should be everything and American.
Dr. Bush.
I'm curious to hear a little bit more about these leadership programs.
Yeah.
I think they bring up the distinction between a credential and, say, wisdom or knowledge or understanding. So I'm wondering what kind of place there might be for that kind of credential and where these schools of civic leadership can come in and fill the gaps. So maybe the academics could answer the latter part and you could answer the former part.
What do you mean by a credential? Like the fact that you've been...
Something they can put on their resume to show they have
Yeah.
leadership experience. I mean, I guess it connects to what's the motivation of folks who are taking these in the first place. Because I do think you're right, there's a sense of the gap. I'm not sure the people are going into these programs because of that sense of the gap.
Yeah, well, I agree. I mean, I think that it's become, like everything else, just one of the tedious resume building exercises that you do, before, during, and after college. And it's really weird. I get the local, we still get a print newspaper every week in my town, and multiple times I see articles in there of different students from high school who've created some nonprofit. So there's this one that these two people from the high school created to get middle schoolers interested in STEM careers. And I'm like, it's like if you haven't created your own nonprofit, and now the new one is, have you published research in high school? Do you have published peer review research? And it's like, I think we're creating like incredibly cynical people who are clearly doing all this stuff because they want to get into a good school, which will then get them the job with the thing. Everything is calculated out from before birth, of these kids' lives. And it wasn't like that when I was younger. And I do feel like, man, these people must just be deeply cynical, about society and like what it takes to get along in it. Because I do wonder, like, how much of this stuff is even undertaken on a legitimate basis versus, again, designed to just be one more little step you have to go through in order to, one day be appointed to the board of directors of the Chamber of Commerce or something like that. And also show that you're doing your ESG work for your company. I think the idea of credentialing is actually like, I think it's gotten, we're over-credentialed, I would say, in our society. And
Isn't the university degree for a lot of people just a credential, though?
yes, exactly, of course. I mean, that's what I would say, yeah.
And just one follow-up, where are the Gen Xers?
Oh, that would be me.
Because, yeah, but you're saying you didn't get that cynical kind of education.
Well, I mean, we're kind of like cynical by character, I think, on some of this stuff. You can see my analysis of these things. Yeah, I mean, we certainly got through before, before this stuff. A lot of us before it took off and did those things. So I think there are people I know who are my age who went through some of these programs. People who were more, more apt to do those things than I was. I was really focused mostly on just working, and consulting. But I know there are people who went through it, for sure. I think we were lucky to, I think, though, get far enough down the path in our career before a lot of this stuff took off. It was a lot easier for us to get into college. We didn't have to do all the stuff you got to do to get in today. So it's just a much more competitive and much more difficult environment today than it was, when I was younger. And so it's like, that's sort of the game you have to play.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, and I was going to say, in agreeing with that, then the other thing that you see is all that stuff that they're doing doesn't make them happier. In fact, it makes them more miserable. So I think maybe we escaped it just barely, but the generation that we all teach, if we're teachers, or our own children, maybe kids from 15 to 25, 30 maybe, they're just caught up in this notion of credentialing and achievement, and it's making them absolutely miserable, and it's taking time away from the things that might make them happy in life, like forming relationships, getting married, having children. I mean, nobody wants to talk about, actually people are starting to talk about those things Aaron works on this, on marriage and the place of young men. All that credentialing stuff gets in the way of the things that are truly life-giving.
Thank you.
Something was said earlier about how we've kind of learned to be entertained by the battle of politics. I'm wondering how we could show, practical tips for how we could show leadership to kind of reframe that and put the emphasis on the correct things.
During this semester at Baylor, my husband and I are teaching a class called, it's called The Hardest Issues of Our Age, but it's basically a class on how to do civil discourse. And we were talking in class the other day about how weird it would be for the students to watch two people having a civilized debate on television and how boring they would find that. And we said, that's a problem, because it used to be that a real debate was substantive, people were respectful to one another, somebody would probably win, or it was very likely that someone would win in the end, but it wasn't what it is now. And I said, why do you think that is? And they said, well, it's fun to watch political battle. It's fun to turn on Fox or CNBC and see the sides go at each other. And I think one way to maybe remedy this to some extent is to pull back from the politicization of everything. I mean, the reason people are in battles all the time is that we're advertising our political views all the time. If we could step, not that politics isn't important, but if we could step back and say, I'm not just a conservative, progressive, Republican, Democrat, but I am a person who has these interests, or I have these family relationships, or I live in this place, or I do this thing for a hobby. I mean, there are all these other dimensions of human experience that could give us more possibility of healthy relationships, but it is the politicization of everything. Everything becomes political in that way, and I think is deeply damaging to friendships.
But Elizabeth, remember the old civil discourse of somebody like Bill Buckley? It was civil, but it was also incredibly witty.
Yeah, that was entertaining too.
Yeah.
With the enormous administrative state that we have, both at the federal government and at the state level, could you comment on the importance of the study, not of democracy, but of bureaucracy in civics education? And I would note there's very little in the academic realm on the study of bureaucracy versus the study of politics and other aspects of civic life.
Who would like to field that?
I mean, I'll just give you my instinctive response before I hand it over to the scholars. I mean, bureaucracy is often at war with democracy, and there's nothing that is better designed to make the citizen feel powerless and therefore disenfranchised and therefore civically impotent than bureaucracy is.
Think of Woodrow Wilson's work.
Thank you. I think we're in a situation where I think we need to view the truth of where we stand societally. I don't think that the control of the media, whether it be the new media or the new media, lesser now, or the old media, or academia, society, anything, seems to be this 50-50 country, or maybe even 55-45 or something towards the left. I think, though, that the progressive left has been so skilled at controlling institutions for decades, basically since World War II or before, that we think that the country is indeed kind of this 50-50 thing, whereas I would argue that somebody could sit and posit a 4 or 5 sentence introduction to several questions, and we would get a great deal more than 50% of the country agreeing with certain things. If we pull the names, if we pull the Trump names and the Biden names and the Obama names out of it and just ask these things, I think we would see a great deal of it. There is still severe danger with whether it be progressivism, communism, despotism, whatever, there's a severe danger that they will continue to control the media message, the academia, that everything sprouts from, hence why a great deal of this conference. But I think if we can say, what do we need to do? What are the steps, as Aaron said, what are the steps we need to get to now instead of just flapping our jaw and wringing our hands and clutching pearls and stuff? What are the steps we need to get to right now to say, we need to educate these people? A great deal, enormously quickly, is happening in the podcast world, in YouTube and Rumble world. I mean, you've got the Rogans and you've got the Bill Maher's, et cetera, that are still firmly entrenched on the left, but they are being yanked to the right, quote unquote, because the middle is moving to the left. I think everyone has seen the little chart that Elon Musk did, and he goes, here's me. He goes, but the left is moving so far to the left that the center is now on the left of me. I'm by default becoming a conservative on so many issues, not everything, a bunch of social issues. He is still, but he is
Any
seeing
question?
That. Well, my question is,
Okay.
what are the things that we can do to make sure we go after this right now and not just talk about it and realize that a great deal of the country, far larger than we think, is really not as progressive as the media would have us believe or academia?
It seems to me there are a lot of things going on right now that are trying to counter that. This institute being one of them, the other institutes springing up in Tennessee and Florida and elsewhere being another, and frankly, the classical school movement. I mean, think about Great Hearts, and my own children go to a Christian classical school, and there are lots of them, and they've come up in the last 25 years. It seems to me a lot of people are seeing the problem that you identify, and they're trying to do something about it on the ground, and they're doing it for people whose minds are not yet formed, for kids and for college students. So I think there is a growing sense that we're not just going to sit by and let this stuff happen. We can actually make some changes in it. And so I think there are people who are taking that in hand and doing it.
Speaking of which, we have the new director of the Classical Education Institute here, Carol McNamara. Thanks for coming.
I was just going to ask that same question. What's the role of liberal education in sort of supporting or directing students towards a better civic education? How can those two work together to produce a sort of more serious-minded civic population? More serious human beings, better citizens.
Well, my sense is that it's vital. For one thing, it allows, a real liberal education allows people to see the world through different lenses. In other words, most of us maybe are inclined to see the world practically and politically, but you can look at the world aesthetically. You can look at the beauty of the world if you choose to. You can look at the world from the point of view of science. And if you are in a program where you are encouraged to see the world in that way, you are sort of released from the tyranny of politics. I'm making an Oakshottian point here, I think, but it's very much true that liberal education frees you not only from all the things we were talking about this morning, but it frees you from the notion that my only existence as a practical political person in the here and now. And that to me is a great first step.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you. First of all, I want to commend Aaron on his observation about leadership programs. As someone who's been developing them for 28 plus years, I can appreciate the fact that groupthink begets groupthink. So not all leadership programs are the same. So my question is, if our leadership programs are feeding into this categorization of left, right, conservative, liberal, aren't we just feeding into the same vicious cycle and feeding into the groupthink?
Well, I would say, there's like multiple layers of it. I mean, if I'm hearing what people are saying, and I admit that I was somewhat vocational in my education, going to business school as an undergrad. When I think about liberal education, it's about the formation of the person. Then we can think about, civics as kind of the basics of our society and our government and how they function. And I think there's a lot of that you can get that does not have particularized outcomes embedded in it. So we can all agree on certain things about the kind of people that we hope to be, or even the way that we want our country to work, and yet disagree on policies and things of that nature. But I would certainly agree that groupthink is as much a danger in sort of any domain. If we're not careful, group dynamics will take over, and you'll end up someplace nobody wanted to be. There's a great study on that called the Abilene Paradox, about how a group of people in this family ended up taking a trip to Abilene, Texas, even though none of them wanted to go there. But it was sort of about the nature of group dynamics. You get together, everybody starts agreeing on things, and you think everybody else wants it, but all of a sudden you end up someplace nobody wants to go. And so I think that those dynamics we're all susceptible to those. All susceptible to those, regardless of our points of view.
Yeah, lemmings don't make good citizens.
What was that?
Lemmings don't make good citizens.
Lemmings don't make good citizens. Okay. I think that because there are different ways to think about politics and about what it means to be human, about how to live one's life, doesn't necessarily mean that we are lemmings or that we are in categories of groupthink. It means that we have to make choices. And education is about making choices. So,
Can I add one more thing?
absolutely.
Just like maybe the
final
the question I wish someone had asked, because somebody asked about bureaucracy. I think one of the things my observation has been as we read about classical civilization, the great books, the foundings, almost entirely material from a pre-Second Industrial Revolution society. And I think with the Second Industrial Revolution, large-scale urbanization, we live in an unprecedented era in human history in terms of some of our material conditions. And I do think we also need to figure out how to educate people in the reality of certain aspects of our society, like bureaucracy in the administrative state and what it does, the role of media, like how mass media and social media function in our society, educating our children to understand and be masters of the media, not media. I think that's something that I think needs to be added to some of these traditional forms, these particularly post-Second Industrial Revolution conditions of our society.